Do you remember this girl?
I thought she died that night.
She survived because of you.
That necklace, I gave it to you.
I wore it every day.
You're the little girl I saved. They're bowing to you.
I am their queen now. But I crossed the stars for you.
Marcus Vane was in the middle of a heated argument with a Threnka freight dispatcher about a coolant authorization that had been filed correctly and was being processed incorrectly when the message arrived on his comm. And his first reaction, not the considered one, but the instinctive one, was the specific quiet dread that comes from seeing the header of Earth's Diplomatic Affairs Division in a place where you do not expect it. He held up a finger at the dispatcher, who had 4 of them, and all 4 were currently deployed in expressive configurations that communicated professional frustration with the additional dimension that Threnka body language added to frustration, and stepped away from the freight counter to read. The message was short: official priority seal, his name and registry number, his confirmed location on Vithara Station, and a request, framed in the polite language that Earth's diplomatic offices used for things that were not optional, to present himself at Diplomatic Wing B, Corridor 7, at 1400 hours local. No explanation, no context. Sent from the Office of Galactic Relations, Terran Diplomatic Service, which was an office Marcus had never personally dealt with in 17 years of humanitarian convoy work. He looked at the time, 2 hours and 12 minutes. Mr. Vane, the Threnka dispatcher said behind him, all 4 arms reconfigured into something that suggested waiting. The transit authorization was filed 11 days ago, Marcus said, not looking up from his comm. If the dock authority failed to process it, the coolant tender is entitled to demurrage at the standard rate of 7 credits per hour from the point of authorized entry. I will get you the filing reference. Have your dock supervisor contact the authority directly. He pocketed his comm and looked at the dispatcher. They will move. Nobody wants to explain an accrual to their oversight board. The dispatcher made a sound Marcus had learned, over years of working cargo routes, to identify as reluctant agreement in Threnka, and began moving toward the freight offices. Marcus watched him go, and then stood still for a moment in the commercial level of Vithara Station, surrounded by the ordinary noise of a working port, cargo carts, and translation hums, and the particular mechanical breath of a ventilation system that was functional without being well maintained. He tried to think of any legitimate reason Earth's diplomatic office would send a priority summons to a logistics coordinator. He came up with nothing reassuring. He went to deal with the filing reference, and then he went to find out what the Diplomatic Affairs Division wanted with him. Vithara was the kind of station that existed because 3 competing commercial corridors needed a place to intersect without anyone owning the intersection. In practice, this meant it functioned as neutral ground maintained by mutual economic interest rather than trust, and the commercial level reflected this with the organized heterogeneity of a place where every species had agreed to tolerate every other species because the alternative was commercially worse. Marcus had been docking here several times a year for a decade. He knew the freight routes, the mechanics worth trusting, which of the commissary vendors served coffee that tasted like coffee, and which served something that aspired to be coffee in the way that an illustration of fire aspires to warmth. He had never, in 10 years, received anything from the diplomatic wing except a routine customs flag that turned out to be a paperwork error. The diplomatic wing was architecturally different from the rest of the station, quieter, more deliberate in its proportions, the kind of design that communicated sensitivity without stating it. A Terran consular aide met him at the entrance, young and precise in the way of people who have been briefed to expect something but not told exactly what, and walked him toward Corridor 7. Marcus saw the checkpoint before they reached it. 3 officers in Velnarath military livery, positioned at the junction, with the posture of people doing security work, specifically the posture of people doing security work who were not in the routine register of it. The Velnarath were a species Marcus had worked alongside on freight negotiations several times over the years. Organized, precise, efficient in the cold institutional way of a well-run military bureaucracy. They tended to look at humans with the mild disinterest of people who had categorized you and moved on. This was his standard experience of them. These 3 were not looking at him with mild disinterest. The lead officer had a checkpoint tablet in one hand. As Marcus approached, he could see the screen from the edge of his peripheral vision, already open to something. Not blank the way a checkpoint tablet was when waiting for a subject, turned slightly inward, toward the officer, rather than toward whoever was being checked, something that had been loaded before Marcus arrived. He was close enough to see that the open file had a photograph in the upper corner. His photograph. Marcus Vane, the lead officer said, in galactic standard, with the precise accent of someone whose first language assembled sounds from completely different physiological equipment. Credentials, please. Marcus handed over his registry chip without comment. The officer took it but did not scan it. The two flanking officers stayed at attention in a configuration 1 shade 2 alert for a routine document check. The lead officer spoke quietly into his collar communicator, and Marcus caught nothing of what was said. The response came back in under 10 seconds. The lead officer's posture shifted, barely, a fraction of a degree of something releasing, a tension that had been held under moving into a different register. He returned Marcus's chip without scanning it and said, in the flat tone of a man delivering a sentence he had been told to deliver, "You are cleared to proceed. My apologies for the delay." The aide beside Marcus had gone very still in the particular way of someone whose expectations for a routine escort have just been significantly complicated. Marcus said thank you and kept moving. And then he heard it from the far end of the corridor. Not footsteps, but the organized sound of a group in formation. Coordinated movement with a center of gravity that the space around it reorganized itself toward. He turned. The Velkari honor escort came first. 4 guards in pale ceremonial armor that caught the corridor light at different angles with a slight iridescence, moving with the precise economy of professionals whose training had sublimated the performance into reflex. Behind them, flanked by 2 more guards, a person who walked the way that certain people walk when they have accepted that rooms will reorganize themselves around them and have decided that this changes nothing about how they intend to move. The Velkari were, in the taxonomic broadest sense, humanoid, bipedal, bilateral, within the human range of height, the expected number of limbs. The word humanoid stopped being useful at the level of detail. The bone structure was elongated in the torso, slightly compressed at the joints in ways that made the proportions subtly wrong to human eyes without being identifiably alien until you looked carefully. The skin was charcoal gray with a quality Marcus had always found difficult to name precisely. Some translucency over something that caught and held light in ways that varied with angle, as though something underneath was faintly and independently luminous. The eyes were pale gold with vertical pupils, adapted for wavelengths that human eyes could not reach. The person at the center of the escort was a queen. Marcus understood this before he processed any specific indicator. It was in the walk, the quality of how the space around her differed, the way the guards organized themselves not around her like a protective formation, but around her like a frame, around something that was the primary fact of the picture. He registered it, the way experienced cargo workers register a container that is wrong before they have counted the discrepancy, the knowledge arriving before the evidence. She was past him before he had caught up with his own recognition, and then she stopped. She turned, and her eyes found him, and the expression on her face was not surprise. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for confirmation of something and has just received it. "Marcus Vane," she said, in English. The accent was careful the way a learned accent is careful. Each sound placed with the attention of someone who has studied the language from recordings rather than immersion, who understands the words before she has internalized the music of them. His name, in that voice, arrived somewhere in his chest with a weight that did not match the neutral meaning of a name. "Yes," he said, because it was. She held his gaze for a moment that was deliberate and calibrated, the way certain moments are when the person holding them understands their weight. Then there is a great deal to discuss. "Walk with me." He walked with her, behind him, as they moved toward the diplomatic wing's secure section. He heard one of the Velnarath officers murmur something to his colleague. He did not turn to look, but he noted, in the part of his brain that noticed things without being explicitly directed to, that the lead officer's voice had the quality of a man revising a report he had not yet filed, his posture carrying the specific adjustment of someone whose expected outcome for the next 10 minutes has not materialized. The room she led him to was small and practical, a table, 4 chairs, a window showing the station exterior and the dark beyond it, 1 guard inside, 1 at the door. She sat across the table from him, with her hands resting flat on the surface, in the posture of someone who has been preparing for this conversation for a long time, and is now in it. 7 years and 4 months ago, she said. A Velkari vessel called the Sovereign's Hand was traveling through the Turthan shipping lane when it sustained damage to its tertiary systems. An emergency pod was deployed incorrectly, internally, in the service corridor on Deck 3. She paused. You were aboard the Sovereign's Hand that day, doing documentation work for your convoy. He remembered it immediately, not because he thought about it often, he did not, but because certain things lodge in memory with unexpected permanence, and what he remembered was specific. The amber quality of the emergency lighting in the corridor, secondary amber rather than full alert red, too warm for a crisis and for that reason slightly wrong. The smell, chemical and almost sweet, which he later learned was Velkari hull sealant compound reacting with a coolant leak in the tertiary duct, a smell that had no business existing in a damaged ship corridor. An emergency pod deployed internally in a secondary junction, which was not how those pods were designed to function. And inside the pod, a figure not human, breathing in the shallow, labored way that told him, even without medical training, that the breathing was the problem. I was there for a manifest check, he said. The logistics coordinator who was supposed to do it was handling a discrepancy. I took the service corridor because the main deck was blocked for a security sweep. I misread the signage at the 3rd junction. He paused. That was you. Yes, she said. He sat with that for a moment. 7 years and 4 months. He had filed a report describing an unidentified Velkari individual, status critical, transferred to Sovereign's Hand medical personnel. He had gone back to checking manifests. The discrepancy had turned out to be a misfiled weight classification. He had eaten dinner and slept and continued his work. I did not know you were royal, he said. I know, she said. Something moved in her expression that was not quite sentiment but lived close to it. You called for emergency medical assistance. You relayed the pod's internal readings to your convoy's medical staff. You stayed in the corridor until the Sovereign's Hand's medical team arrived and described my condition accurately enough that they knew
what they were addressing before they reached me.
She paused. Before I explain the rest, I want to tell you something that I have not told anyone. He waited. Do you know what I remember most clearly about you? She said. In 7 years of thinking about that corridor, he had no answer for that. He said nothing. You were humming, she said. He looked at her. When you came down that corridor, she said, some human tune, low and slightly off key, completely unaware you were doing it. I heard you before I heard your footsteps clearly enough to identify your species by gait. I had been in that pod for approximately 40 minutes, listening to every sound in that corridor, trying to identify each one, trying to determine whether it was safe to activate the interior distress signal, whether doing so would help me or make my situation significantly worse. She held his gaze steadily, and then I heard you humming, and something in the quality of it, the complete ordinary casualness of it, told me before I could see you that whoever was coming down that corridor was not there with any dangerous purpose. They were simply going about their work. A pause. That was the moment I decided it was safe to activate the pod's interior distress light, so you would see it through the pod portal. Marcus stared at her. He had no recollection of humming. He almost certainly had been. He hummed without knowing it on cargo walks, during routine manifest checks, an old habit that colleagues over the years had occasionally pointed out, and that he had never been able to correct because he was never aware he was doing it. The medical team, he said slowly. They found you because of the interior light. Yes, she said. And they found me because you were in the corridor. And I am alive to tell you this because you stopped. She looked at him with a steadiness that had something behind it now, something that had been held for a long time. I have not told anyone that detail. It is not in any report. It has no political relevance. It is simply the thing I remember most specifically and most clearly about the person who saved my life. She held his gaze. I wanted you to know that I remember you, not a human who happened to be there. You, Marcus, sat with this for a long moment. The room was quiet except for the station's operational hum, the baseline sound of a structure doing its work. He thought about a specific habit he had never been able to account for, and about the fact that it had apparently mattered in ways that did not connect to any professional skill he possessed. Okay, he said, which was entirely inadequate, but was the only honest thing he had. She continued with the mercy of someone who understands when a person needs not to be looked at directly for a moment. You stayed, she said. When the medical team arrived, you described the pod configuration, the lighting conditions, the smell in the corridor, the approximate time since you found me, and the specific readings you had been monitoring on the pod's internal display. You did this because it was the most useful thing you could do in that situation. Then you filed a logistics note and returned to your work. She paused. I do not know if you thought about it afterward. Not much, he said honestly. No, she said. I know, a moment of quiet. I have thought about it for 7 years. That is a very unequal distribution of attention, and I think you deserve to understand why. What she told him over the next 30 minutes was this. The Galactic Council had voted 3 times in the past 5 years on a resolution to reclassify Earth from its current designation as an unaligned world in good standing to contested resource status. Diplomatic language for a category that entitled member species to request oversight rights, survey access, resource development consultation protocols. The language made it sound administrative. What it meant, in the freight corridors Marcus worked near contested zones, was the first step toward something that ended with humanity having significantly less say about its own future. The votes had failed each time, by margins that should not have existed. In each case, the Velkari bloc had voted against, and the Velkari bloc occupied a position in council politics sufficiently central that their votes had been the thing that moved other votes, the gravitational center around which each session reorganized itself. Marcus asked the questions he asked with anything complex. Who initiates? Who seconds? What the threshold is for passage? Whether there was documentation? She answered each with the precision of someone who lived in these processes rather than studied them. You have been using your political weight to protect Earth, he said. Yes, she said. Since when? Since my coronation, 5 years ago. She held his gaze. I changed the Velkari position on 3 active dossiers relating to humanity's galactic status. I have done this because of what you did in that corridor. He thought about the inadequacy of the exchange. A logistics coordinator who had not known he was humming, who had stayed in a damaged ship's service corridor because leaving did not occur to him as an available option, had produced 5 years of galactic political operations by a sitting queen. Why, he said. Because you are the first person I have directly encountered who breaks every model the Council uses to predict human behavior, she said. The standard galactic framework for interspecies interaction is transactional. Every significant action has an expected value calculation behind it. This is not cynicism. It is simply how most species, including my own, navigate situations involving resources or risk. We calculate expected value. She held his gaze. You do not calculate first. You see a problem that needs to be addressed, and you address it, and you hum while you are doing it. That is not an entry in any galactic model I have encountered. And it is, in my assessment, the most important thing I have personally observed in 20 years of diplomatic work. He thought about it more carefully than the framing seemed to invite. I have let things go, he said. I have been focused on the job and passed something by. I am not incapable of the calculation. I know, she said. I am not describing a species of saints. I am describing a species whose baseline behavior in moments of low personal stakes and high inconvenience includes a reflexive category, the category of simply doing the obvious right thing, because it is the obvious right thing, that most galactic models have no entry for. She picked up her cup. Galactic does not forget. Marcus, that is the part you never understood. You filed a logistics note and went back to work. The record of what you did is not in a logistics note. He looked at the window, the dark beyond the station glass, the slow drift of ships. He thought about the checkpoint tablet, with his photograph already open before he arrived. What changed? He said. You have managed 3 votes. What is different now? She paused, for the first time since they had sat down. The answer did not arrive immediately, and the shape of the pause was the shape of something being selected rather than something being concealed. Not a lie. A decision about how much of the truth to place on the table. The 4th vote is in 48 hours, she said. This proposal has been structured differently from the previous 3. Someone has spent considerable time studying how the earlier votes failed and has addressed those specific points. My position is more constrained this time. Voting against will require me to expose aspects of my reasoning that I have kept private. And if those aspects become public, they create a vulnerability I cannot address while also managing the vote. The aspects you have kept private, Marcus said. They involve me. A pause that was slightly too long. Partly, she said. The Velnarath checkpoint outside had my photograph already open before I arrived, he said. Not pulled up during a scan. Already open. Facing the officer. Waiting. Someone told them to expect me specifically. That is not a customs procedure. That is someone who knows I am here and has prepared for my presence. He kept his voice even. The voice he used when a logistics problem was more complicated than it appeared, and he needed the other party to keep talking. Someone is already moving. Yes, she said. How long has someone been watching me? She held his gaze, and the answer came with the weight of each year it covered. 7 years, she said. He sat with that. He thought about a customs delay at Mira Station 2 years ago that had resolved overnight when someone made a call he never found out about. A freight contract that had disappeared and returned unexpectedly 3 months later. An inspection on Vithara that had been initiated and then canceled without explanation. He had attributed all of it to the ordinary friction of complex bureaucratic systems. Decisions made and reversed for reasons that never reached him. 7 years of that. From your direction, he said. I will give you the full answer tomorrow morning, she said, in the secure wing, when I can give you the complete context. Tonight I want you to have what I have told you and sit with it. A pause. I know that may feel insufficient. It is fine, he said. He could see she had reasons, and pushing against reasons tonight would produce friction rather than information. She nodded once, the slight dip of a head that carried more weight than a larger gesture would have, and stood. He watched her move down the corridor toward the senior diplomatic suite, her guards reforming around her. And then the aide from earlier appeared to show him to his temporary quarters. The quarters were serviceable. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. Stars, the hull of the station, a cargo vessel moving on its departure vector at the unhurried pace of scheduled transit. He thought about a checkpoint tablet with his photograph already loaded, and a Velnarath lead officer who had looked at him not with the mild professional disinterest he was accustomed to from that species, but with something that had more going on underneath it, something closer to managed anxiety than disinterest, something being held. He thought about a woman who had remembered the specific sound of his humming for 7 years, had used that single sensory detail to decide it was safe to activate an interior distress light, and had then built 5 years of galactic political operations around what she decided about the person on the other side of that sound. He showed her the station. Not the diplomatic wing, but the commercial level. The main thoroughfares where the species mixture was at its most complete. Thranka freight crews in rapid negotiation with customs officials. A trio of Orathani representatives moving in the slow, deliberate way of beings whose biology operated on a slightly longer timescale than the rest of the port. 2 humans from a deep survey operation in conversation with a vendor that seemed from the outside entirely mismatched in scale and anatomy, but was apparently proceeding well. The sounds and smells and organized chaos of a working port where more than a dozen civilizations had agreed to coexist because the commercial alternative was worse. Athara walked beside him with her guards at a distance that suggested she had asked them to be inconspicuous, which they were, in the way of people very skilled at something that cannot quite be made fully invisible. They walked slowly, with the guards well back, through the Thranka freight section and the Orathani transit offices and the human-operated commissary vendors and the mixed species dispute resolution kiosk that had 3 cases pending and 2 mediators working them simultaneously. The commercial level had the quality of most commercial spaces in complex stations. Everyone here had arrived from somewhere else and intended to leave again, and the impermanence of everyone's presence produced a temporary tolerance that permanent residences rarely managed. The Thranka, she said, with a slight inclination of her head toward the freight negotiation he had left earlier, were classified as a hostile species in council records until approximately 200 years ago. Active suppression of their trade networks, 2 intervention conflicts. The official position was that their social structure was too collective to be trusted as individual diplomatic actors. She paused. The official position was wrong. It took 50 years of economic data and 3 council reformations to establish this, but it was wrong. She looked at the Orathani delegation. The Orathani were classified as too biologically foreign for diplomatic standing within my grandmother's lifetime. The argument was that their sensory experience of reality was too different from the galactic consensus to allow for reliable treaty interpretation. Another brief pause. Also, wrong. And humans, Marcus said. Humanity is not foreign in a way that frightens the council, she said. Humanity is familiar in a way that frightens the council. You develop on a curve the standard models do not account for. You adapt faster than species that have been spacefaring for centuries. You form genuine attachments to species you have met for the first time, which produces decision-making that the standard models also do not account for. She stopped walking, and he stopped with her, and she looked at him with something that had moved just slightly past diplomatic. You also, occasionally, take wrong turns in service corridors and stay with injured aliens until medical personnel arrive. I had a manifest to check, he said. Yes, she said. And this time, the thing that was not quite a smile came considerably closer to being one. You did, she resumed walking, and he fell back into step beside her. Galactic does not forget. Marcus, that is the part you never understood. You filed a logistics note and went back to your work. The record of what you did is not in that logistics note. He thought about this as they turned back toward the diplomatic wing, the sounds of the commercial level receding behind them. He thought about the checkpoint tablet with his photograph already open. He thought about a Velnarath lead officer looking at him not with the mild, professional disinterest he was accustomed to from that species, but with something that had more going on underneath it, something that needed to be managed. He thought about the checkpoint officer, the managed quality of what had been in his eyes. That was not standard Velnarath behavior around humans. The Velnarath were precise and neutral in the way of a species that had decided efficiency was the appropriate relationship with neutrality. What he had seen in the officer's eyes was something that was being controlled, not something neutral, something that had information in it that did not match the performed version of the interaction. He thought about the photograph already open before he arrived. Someone had told the officers to expect Marcus Vane. Someone had told them to hold, then told them to stand down when the Queen's escort appeared. The stand-down order had come within seconds of him seeing her, which meant someone had been watching the corridor and had given the order in real time, which meant there was at least one other person on this station, outside his view, with the kind of access that allowed them to issue and revoke orders to Velnarath checkpoint personnel. That was a significant level of access for someone on a neutral commercial station. He thought about a woman who had remembered the specific sound of his humming for 7 years, and who had built something from it that was large enough to require this level of opposition. He thought about whether he trusted her. He found, which surprised him slightly, that he did. Not because she had told him everything. She had not. But because the things she had told him had the specific quality of things told to someone who is being prepared for something real, rather than things told to produce a specific reaction. She had given him the things that would disturb him as readily as the things that would reassure him. That was the behavior of someone who needed him to be accurate rather than cooperative. He filed what he did not know in the part of his mind that did not release problems until they resolved. And he went to sleep. The secure meeting was at 800 hours, in a room deeper in the diplomatic wing, with an additional layer of noise suppression and views only of the station interior rather than the exterior. Ethra was already there when the aide brought Marcus in, seated at the table with a cup of something steaming in front of her that was almost certainly not coffee, with the posture of a person who had arrived early, because she needed the time to arrange herself before the other person came through the door. He sat down. The aide left and closed the door. She said, "I want to tell you something that is not in any report." He waited. "Over the past 5 years," she said, "I have received a weekly intelligence summary from my diplomatic office, standard format, regional developments, council positioning updates, surveillance assessments of relevant actors." She looked at the table and then back at him, with the quality of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for a long time and has finally arrived at the decision. One of the standing items in that summary, for the past 5 years. Is a notation of your convoy's current route and port of call. He did not say anything. I told myself it was political intelligence, she said. That knowing your location allowed me to respond if something moved in your direction. That is true. It is also not the complete truth. She set down her cup. I read your shipping manifests every week. Marcus, your route filings, your cargo designations, your port registrations across 7 stations. I read them because I could not stop wanting to know that you were all right. She looked at him steadily, with the quality of someone accepting the weight of what they are saying, rather than deflecting from it. I am aware of how that sounds. I am telling you anyway, because you are about to walk into a situation in which understanding why I brought you here matters enormously, and you cannot fully understand that without understanding this. The room was quiet except for the station's hum. That is, Marcus said carefully, the most unexpected thing anyone has said to me in 17 years of cargo work. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but its first cousin, seen from a distance. I imagine it is, she said. He sat with it for a moment, the manifest reading, the weekly notation. He thought about what it meant that a queen had been reading his freight routes, and found that it landed somewhere different from where he expected it to land. Not strange, not alarming. Something closer to finding out that someone had been keeping the lights on in a building he thought was empty. 3 votes, he said. You managed 3 votes by positioning the Valkyrie block. What does the 4th vote look like? That is different. She folded her hands on the table. The 4th proposal is structurally different. The faction that drafted it has studied the previous 3 failures carefully. They have closed the specific procedural gaps I used in the first 3 sessions. My ability to vote against reclassification without exposing the personal basis of my position is significantly narrowed. She paused. And someone within that faction has determined that exposing the personal basis is worth more to them as a political weapon than the vote itself is. They do not need the reclassification to pass this session. They need my reasoning to become a matter of public council record. Once my investment in your situation is formally documented, they can use it in the sessions that follow. They can argue that the Valkyrie position on Earth has been driven by sentiment rather than policy, and that 3 prior votes were therefore procedurally compromised. And that argument works, Marcus said. It is not without merit, she said, in galactic governance terms. A head of state making block decisions based on personal attachment to a private individual from an unaligned world is exactly the kind of irregularity that the council was designed to check. She held his gaze. I brought you here because you are the only person who can speak to certain events, without a prepared script and without a political stake, that the council can identify as a motive. You are the only witness whose account cannot be dismissed as strategically motivated, except for the part where my homeworld is the subject of the vote, he said. Yes, she said, except for that. He thought about what he was being asked, or what was being arranged around him, and found that the thinking was less complicated than the situation seemed to require. Someone needed him to say what happened in a corridor 7 years ago. He could say that. He had been saying what happened in corridors for 17 years. You said the situation became more complex operationally, he said. Something moved this week specifically. What was it? She was quiet for a moment. Someone began moving towards you directly, she said. The administrative interference I had been running around your movements, the protective layer I mentioned, began encountering resistance at a higher institutional level than I had previously seen. It indicated that a party with significant resources had decided you were worth going around me to access. She paused. I needed you here, where I can see what is happening around you, rather than on a convoy route, where I cannot. So the summons was also cover, Marcus said. Yes. And the Velnarath checkpoint had my photograph ready, because they were already waiting for me to arrive. Someone told them to wait, she said. The order came through a channel I am still working to trace. He thought about the checkpoint tablet, the controlled anxiety in the lead officer's eyes, the way they had backed down completely when Athara appeared, not with reluctance, but with the speed of people who had been told that a specific outcome should be avoided and were now avoiding it. They were supposed to intercept me, he said, before I reached you, and they were told to stand down when your escort came into view. That is my reading, she said. Which means the person who sent the stand-down order is different from the person who issued the original intercept order, he said. Or the same person decided that a public confrontation in the diplomatic wing carried too much risk. Either way, someone is managing several moving pieces, and they have enough institutional access to issue and revoke orders in the Velnareth checkpoint system on a neutral station. Athara looked at him with the quality of someone who has just received information they expected and are confirming it. Yes, she said. That is a significant level of access, he said. Yes, she said again. And the way she said it, with the weight of something she had been thinking about for longer than this conversation, told him that she had a candidate for who held that level of access, and that the candidate was not anyone from the Vel-Nareth side of the equation. He was about to ask the next question when the blast hit. Not close. The percussion reached them through the station structure. Vibration in the table surface first, and then in the floor. The station absorbing a significant energy event somewhere in its body. The emergency lighting outside the door shifted to secondary amber. The guard inside the room was already moving. Athara was on her feet. The guard spoke into his collar communicator and received a rapid response, then said something to Athara in Velkari, with the specific inflection that Marcus read as urgent without needing to understand the words. Commercial level, Marcus said, already thinking about the station's geometry. He had been docking at Vithara several times a year for a decade. He knew the freight corridors, the access routes, the service connections between sections. Secondary amber means the structural integrity systems are active. The main diplomatic corridor to the transit hub runs under the commercial level utility spine. If the blast was in the infrastructure and there is a secondary event, that route has risk. The guard looked at Athara. She looked at Marcus. 6 junctions from here, he said. There is a personnel access corridor along the station exterior that avoids the utility spine entirely. It connects to the outer ring transit, and from there to the private docking section. She said something to the guard. The guard changed the direction of their movement. They went. The personnel corridor was where Marcus said it was. They moved quickly. The guard ahead, Marcus and Athara in the middle. A second guard who had joined them from the exterior position behind. The corridor was narrow and practical, the kind of space maintained for function rather than comfort, with the slightly lower ceiling of a secondary access route. 2 more blasts, further away and diminishing. The station absorbed them in sequence, and the secondary amber held. No escalation to red, which meant the structural integrity systems were managing. Marcus kept his focus on the corridor geometry, counting junctions, verifying against memory. At the 4th junction, Athara's communicator activated. The voice was Dravath, her guard commander, and the communication was short and sharp, and produced a visible change in her pace that was controlled enough to look like nothing if you were not paying attention. What is it? Marcus said. Coordinated, she said. 3 initiation points. This was not an accident. He processed this while navigating the next junction. 3 coordinated initiation points on the same day he had been summoned to this station. On the same morning they were having this conversation. Someone wanted the chaos, he said. She did not deny it. He navigated them through 2 more turns and then a service access hatch he had used twice before with oversized equipment. And they came out into the transit corridor, cleaner, better lit. The standard route between the outer perimeter of the diplomatic wing and the private docking section. The transit corridor ahead split, left to the main transit hub, right to the private berths. The guard ahead stopped, 6 meters in front of them. 3 figures in Velnareth military uniforms were positioned across the width of the corridor. Not patrol formation, not checkpoint formation, waiting formation, with the specific stillness of people who have been told to expect something and are at the point of execution. The lead figure said, in Galactic Standard, Your Majesty, we hold authorization from the Emergency Protocols Office to conduct a security interview with the civilian registered as Marcus Vane. Please stand aside. Athara did not stand aside. She spoke something rapid and low to Dravath, who had come through a secondary entrance 20 meters behind them. Dravath's response had the inflection of the Velkari equivalent of over my dead body. Marcus watched the geometry of the situation. 3 figures ahead, Athara between guards. 1 authorization that probably existed in some form and would take time to contest. He watched the lead officer's eyes, and they were on him specifically, not on the Queen, with the focused patience of someone whose objective has been identified and who is waiting for the operational moment to move toward it. He took a step to the left. "I will speak with them," he said quietly, to Ethera. She turned to look at him, and her expression was the expression of a person who has just watched a decision step outside her radius of control. "Marcus, if the authorization is valid, contesting it takes time," he said. "You have 48 hours and a vote to manage. I will speak with them. I will be fine." He said this with the calm of a person who has said equivalent things in equivalent situations. Moments where the fastest path through was the direct path, without fully processing what fine would mean in this specific context. Ethara was looking at him with something that lived in the neighborhood of the expression you make when you are watching someone walk toward something and cannot stop them without producing a worse outcome than the thing you are watching them walk toward. "Marcus," she said again. And this time, his name in her voice had a weight he did not have time to hear properly. "I will be fine," he said. He stepped forward. The three Velnarath organized themselves around him with the efficiency of a prepared action. One said this way, "Please," and Marcus followed, because he did not see an immediate reason not to, and because his working instinct was still that the fastest path through a complicated situation was the most direct one. Before she answered, he sat with what she had already told him for a moment. He thought about a queen in a formal diplomatic context, in whatever room she used for intelligence reviews, receiving a weekly summary and reading a section on a cargo convoy run by a logistics coordinator who did not know he was in the summary. He thought about what that meant to do once, and then again, and then every week for 5 years. He thought about the administrative cost of building and maintaining the apparatus required to make those routes safer without the route runner knowing the apparatus existed. He thought about care expressed as infrastructure, as management and protection and absence of friction, as a form of attention that produced nothing visible to the person being attended to. He had not known what to do with the knowledge when she first told him. He was still not sure he knew, but he was increasingly certain that it was not nothing. "How did you run the protection?" he said, specifically. "You said administrative interference across 9 encounters in 7 years. What does that look like from your end of it?" She set down her cup. "The simplest interventions are bureaucratic," she said. A senior review request filed against an inspection process and routed through channels that will take longer to resolve than the inspection window. A transit authorization flag escalated to a level that requires coordination between offices, which takes time. And by the time the coordination completes, your convoy has moved on. She paused. The more complex interventions involved pre-negotiated arrangements with station administrators. A certain category of customs processing for your registered vessels gets routed to an office that understands the category means a slower process. "Understands that means a slower process," he said. "Understands," she said, with the quality of a person choosing a word that is technically precise. Nothing in writing. Nothing that would appear as anything other than ordinary administrative process if someone examined it from outside. The kind of arrangement that exists in every galactic port at some level. She looked at the window. "The difference is that mine were specifically configured around your convoy's routes and schedule." "How long before the blast did you know something was moving?" he asked. 3 days, she said. "I received intelligence that a party I had not previously identified was filing documentation requests against your convoy records from 2 different station authorities simultaneously. That is not how routine freight inspections work. Simultaneous requests from different authorities on the same vessel registry indicates coordination, and coordination at that level requires a specific kind of institutional access." She paused. "I accelerated this meeting. I did not know the format it would take." He thought about this while they were still in the room. Before the blast changed the format for them, he was 2 corridors away, in a cargo transit section he did not recognize from his freight work. Before he began to revise that assessment, the ship at the docking port was unmarked, not unusual in private berths, where many vessels operated without prominent registry markings. But the configuration of the airlock collar was Velnarath military specification, not commercial, not private registry. The specification that appeared in maintenance documentation for military-designated docking operations. A door opened aboard the ship. A figure stepped into the airlock threshold, tall even by Velnarath standards, with the near-colorless pallor of a species adapted for low ambient light. Nothing wasted. nothing surplus in how he occupied space. He wore the formal duty uniform of a Velnarath executor, a rank Marcus had encountered in briefing documentation but never in person. Military-grade authority over diplomatic and intelligence operations. The kind of rank that appeared in dispatches when something significant had been authorized at a level above routine. He looked at Marcus with the focused, settled quality of someone who has reviewed extensive documentation on a subject and is now seeing the subject for the first time in person. "Mr. Vane," he said, "my name is Executor Varric. I have been trying to arrange a conversation with you for approximately 7 years. He stepped back to allow Marcus through the airlock. "I apologize for the circumstances. Please come aboard." Marcus came aboard. The door closed behind him. The room they put him in was functional and deliberately not punitive. Environmental controls set at a temperature slightly cool by human standards but not hostile. The kind of accommodation designed for a subject whose cooperation was more useful than their discomfort. There were no restraints. A medic arrived within the first hour, Velnarath, young by their standards, who checked him over with professional care, using equipment that was different from human standard but applied with the precision of someone who knew their work. She diagnosed a bruised rib Marcus had not noticed acquiring in the transit corridor and administered a treatment that worked faster than anything in his convoy's standard medical kit. She said very little. At one point, after completing the rib treatment, she paused and looked at him with something he interpreted across the species gap as a professional updating an assessment. She said, in Galactic Standard, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Marcus said. She considered the question seriously. The way someone does when they do not dismiss things by reflex. "Something that required more security," she said, and returned to her equipment. He thought about that after she left. Varric came to see him in the early station hours, the time when institutional spaces went quiet in the particular way of institutions at rest. He brought 2 cups of something warm, not coffee, not anything Marcus could identify by sight or smell, but warm and not unpleasant, and set one in front of Marcus with the deliberateness of a gesture that was intended to communicate something about the nature of the conversation that was about to happen. "I want to have an honest conversation," Varric said, sitting across the table, with the posture of someone for whom the table was simply a flat surface and not a boundary. "In my experience, honest conversations are most efficiently achieved by treating the other party as capable of handling honest information." "I appreciate that," Marcus said. Varric looked at him. The Velnarath had eyes adapted for lower ambient light than human eyes or Velkari eyes, darker and less reflective, with a quality Marcus had always found difficult to read from the outside. The expression behind them, operating in a register that did not map cleanly to human facial expression. "I will begin with what I want," Varric said, "and then explain why I want it." "All right," Marcus said. "I want the Queen to sign a reclassification agreement for 3 human colony systems in the Outer Terran sector," Varric said. "Oversight rights, survey access, resource development consultation protocols, not annexation, not displacement. The language is designed to be defensible as administrative in nature." He held Marcus's gaze without emphasis. "The result, over time, would be a Velnarath administrative foothold in human-adjacent space that would significantly complicate humanity's independent development of those systems." "That is very honest," Marcus said. "I said honest," Varric said. "I did not say comfortable." He picked up his cup. "What I have is leverage. You are the leverage. The Queen will not allow you to be harmed. This means she must either comply with the agreement or produce a political alternative that addresses the leverage without capitulating. If she escalates militarily or diplomatically, the resulting conflict costs the Velkari Dominion more than the agreement costs them. She is caught between 2 expensive outcomes. And if she does neither," Marcus said, "then I follow through," Varric said, flat, without pleasure or emphasis. The statement of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at a result he would prefer to avoid but will not refuse. "It would be preferable for everyone involved if she signs." Marcus thought about what it meant to be leverage. To be the variable that made an equation solvable in one direction. He had spent 17 years being the person who made equations work from the logistics end, not the variable that constrained them. "You said 7 years," he said. "You have been trying to arrange this conversation for 7 years. The situation was not ready for 7 years, Varric said. The council vote creates a narrow window in which the leverage is most applicable. He paused. You were not accessible before this. I mean that precisely. There were consistent administrative and procedural complications whenever Velnarath attempted to engage with your person or convoy directly. What kind of complications? Marcus said. Transit clearance delays that required senior review, customs processing irregularities, inspection protocols that were initiated and then canceled at a level above the initiating authority. Varric said this with the precise neutrality of someone reading from a documentation record. Over 7 years, across 11 separate encounters between Velnarath administrative apparatus and your person or convoy, there were interference events in 9 of them. The rate of administrative interference was statistically improbable as coincidence. Marcus looked at the cup in front of him. He thought about the inspection on Vathara that had been canceled without explanation. The freight contract for the Dorith run that had disappeared and returned 3 months later. The overnight resolution at Mira Station. He had attributed all of it to the ordinary friction of complex systems. Bureaucratic decisions made and reversed for reasons that never reached the people experiencing their effects. She was protecting me, he said. Someone was, Varric said. The interventions are consistent with Velkari diplomatic apparatus. This is part of why I consider the Queen's investment in your continued well-being to be a reliable variable in my current planning. He looked at Marcus with the quality of a man delivering a fact that is true, regardless of whether it is welcome. I am sorry the knowledge arrives in this context. Marcus was quiet for a moment. 7 years of friction that had been, from the other direction, protection. The thought arrived slowly and settled with surprising weight. The rescue, he said. Athara told me it was arranged, that someone placed her in that corridor expecting a specific outcome, that I produced a different one. He met Varric's gaze. What was the expected outcome? Varric was quiet for 3 seconds, a notable pause in a man who had been answering without hesitation. He set down his cup. The Velnarath had an interest, 7 years ago, in establishing documentary evidence of human behavior in situations involving alien welfare under operational stress, he said. Specifically evidence of human indifference. A human vessel encountering an alien in medical distress and choosing, after its own risk and inconvenience calculation, to continue on course without rendering assistance. Marcus looked at him. The situation was structured so the evidence could be captured, Varric said. A human convoy vessel docked at the Sovereign's hand. A Velkari royal in a service corridor in a condition that made her require immediate assistance. A documentation unit positioned in the secondary corridor to record any crew members who entered that section. He held Marcus's gaze. The expected behavior, based on our modeling of human interspecies interaction protocols, was non-engagement. Assess the situation. Determine that involvement exceeded operational parameters. Continue on course. The footage would have been submitted as evidence before the council. I was not operating with interspecies protocols, Marcus said. I was checking a manifest. I went down the wrong corridor because I misread a sign. I stayed because leaving did not occur to me. Yes, Varric said. We know that now. The documentation unit, Marcus said. It recorded what actually happened. Yes, Varric said. The footage was filed and sealed because it did not produce the expected outcome. And the expected outcome was the entire purpose of the exercise. Marcus sat with this for a long moment. He thought about a model of human behavior that predicted he would walk past an injured alien in a corridor. He thought about the specific chain of small, unremarkable deviations that had put him in that corridor instead of the one he had been looking for. A wrong turn, a misread sign, a manifest check he had taken over for a colleague who was dealing with a discrepancy. Who authorized the exercise? He said. The original one. Who gave the order? Varric paused again. This pause had a different quality from the earlier ones. Not the pause of calculation, but the pause of a man who has reached the edge of something he is still processing and has not yet determined what is on the other side of it. The authorization structure was standard Velnarath intelligence operation format, Varric said slowly. Valid chain. Correct authentication markers. My understanding, at the time, was that it originated within our intelligence directorate. He stopped. Something was working in his expression that was operating below the surface of what he permitted to be visible, but the working was there. Recent information has suggested that the authorization chain, while formally correct at every documented level, may have been constructed to appear Velnarath in origin while actually originating elsewhere. Marcus looked at him. Varric set down his cup. He placed it on the table, with the careful deliberateness of someone who needs a moment that does not look like a moment. There are aspects of my current situation, he said, that I am still processing. It was the first thing he had said that did not have the quality of prepared speech. It had the quality of something said between prepared statements, true in a way that prepared statements were also true, but more immediately so, more present in the room. Marcus thought about what he had heard. An authorization chain that was formally Velnarath, but might have originated elsewhere. A documentation exercise that was designed to capture human behavior, but captured something its designers had not anticipated. 7 years of subsequent operations, built around the wrong outcome of the original. Someone built the original trap, Marcus said, and when it did not produce what they wanted, they did not abandon it. They watched what grew out of the failure. They waited until the relationship that grew out of what you did not expect became the thing they could use. He looked at Varric steadily. And then they gave you an authorization that looked like yours, to execute an operation that served their purpose. And you executed it, because the paperwork was in order. Varric looked at him. The quality of the look had shifted. Something in it now that had not been there before. Someone used you, Marcus said, the same way they used me, the same way they have been using the friction between your species and hers for however long this has been running. Varric was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Marcus stopped expecting an answer. Then Varric said, in a voice 3 degrees quieter than the one he had been using all evening, I have received information in the past several hours that requires me to significantly revise my understanding of the authorization structure for the original documentation exercise, and for several operations subsequent to it. He paused. The Velnarath Executor's office does not make errors of this type. No, Marcus said, you do not. But someone who understood your authorization structure well enough could route through it, without your office knowing the origin. Someone with enough institutional access to make the paperwork look right from inside. Varric picked up his cup, set it down without drinking, picked it up again, set it down again. It was a small thing, but it was the first uncontrolled physical action Marcus had observed from him in several hours. How does a logistics coordinator from an unaligned world arrive at that analysis in 6 hours of captivity? He said. I spend my professional life figuring out why cargo is not arriving where it is supposed to arrive, Marcus said. The answer is almost always that someone upstream made a decision that changed the routing, and the people downstreams experienced only the effects without knowing the cause. He looked at Varric evenly. Your operation was downstream of a decision you did not know had been made. Varric was quiet for long enough that Marcus could hear the station's structural hum, the baseline sound of a system doing its work. Then Varric stood and said, the formal transfer proceedings will occur in 6 hours. Your belongings will be returned to you before then. The council's session will address several matters simultaneously. He paused at the door. Some of them are not what the parties who called the session intend to address. He left. The room was quiet. Marcus sat and thought about a corridor 7 years ago, and about how far the effects of one wrong turn could travel through a system when a specific person was waiting for the effects to reach them. He thought about what it would mean to walk into a room full of people who had been running calculations on what happened in that corridor and say, here is what actually happened. Let me describe the trap precisely, Varric said. He set down his cup and placed his hands on the table in the flat, deliberate way of someone about to deliver information they want the other person to receive clearly. If the Queen comes to retrieve you through military channels, she activates an emergency protocol that puts Velkari military assets in the vicinity of a Velnarath vessel in a neutral zone. That is a treaty violation under 3 active agreements between our species. The Velkari Dominion loses its protected status in 2 commercial corridors and its observer position on the Resource Allocation Council. He paused. If she comes through diplomatic channels, she is acknowledging publicly that your welfare is a Velkari diplomatic priority, which means she is confirming exactly the characterization that the council faction that sponsored the reclassification vote will use against her. Another pause. If she does not come at all, you are a human civilian held by Velnarath military personnel without authorization. which means Earth's consular office files a formal complaint, which becomes a council matter, which brings the entire question of Earth's status into a formal adversarial proceeding at the worst possible moment. He looked at Marcus. Any path available to her costs her something significant. The question is only which cost she will choose. Marcus thought about this for a moment. And the document you want her to sign, the document removes the leverage, Varric said. If she signs, I release you. The complaint is withdrawn, and the council session proceeds on the original terms of the vote, rather than in the context of a diplomatic incident. The reclassification motion has a better than even chance of passing without the incident. With the incident, it has a near certain chance of passing. He paused. She signs, or she loses more than the document would cost her. Except she will not sign, Marcus said. Varric looked at him. No, he said. She will not. I am aware of this. I am also aware that she will not allow you to be harmed. Which means the conversation you and I are having is not really about the document. The document is a frame. What we are actually negotiating is what it costs her to remove the leverage without signing. He paused. The answer to that question has become more complicated in the past several hours. In the cell, after Varric left, Marcus sat and reconstructed the past 7 years in the way he reconstructed logistics problems that had gone wrong, backwards from the effect to the cause, identifying each node where something had been decided that changed what happened downstream. He thought about the inspection on Vithara 2 years ago that had been canceled without explanation, which he had attributed to a supervisor overriding a junior officer's overzealous flag. The freight contract for the Doroth run that had disappeared and returned 3 months later, which he had attributed to a client changing their mind about the specification. The customs delay at Mira Station that had resolved overnight, which he had attributed to someone making a call that expedited a stuck process. He thought about 9 interference events in 11 encounters across 7 years, each one looking like random noise from inside and looking like managed protection from outside. He thought about the lead Velnarath officer at the checkpoint with the photograph already on the screen. He thought about the 3 coordinated blast initiation points in the commercial section on the same morning as the meeting. He thought about the specific timing of his separation from Ethara in the transit corridor, and about 3 Velnarath personnel in civilian clothing who had been positioned and waiting in exactly the service access route that a logistics coordinator who knew the station would use. Someone had known how Marcus would navigate the station in an emergency. Not a guess, known. Which meant either they had studied him specifically enough to model his decision-making, or they had someone who understood logistic intuition in general, or they had information about how he had navigated the station in previous visits. He thought about the freight records he filed on every visit to Vethara, the service corridor access logs that were part of any cargo delivery documentation, the route stamps that were standard for any vehicle moving between freight levels and service access points. 7 years of route stamps, all of it in documentation systems that were, in theory, accessible to anyone with the right administrative clearance. He thought about 17 years of cargo work and about the specific accumulation of knowledge that comes from 17 years of work in the same industry. He knew freight infrastructure. He knew the language of documentation, formal and informal. He knew how decisions moved through complex systems, how they changed form as they moved, how the original decision that was made by a person in a room became an effect experienced by someone who never met the person or saw the room. He had spent 17 years tracing those chains in reverse, asking why the cargo was not arriving where it was supposed to arrive, and finding the node where the routing had changed. The answer, in this case, was that someone upstream had made a decision before Marcus was born, or nearly, and the effects of that decision had been moving through the system ever since, and everyone downstream had been experiencing those effects as the random friction of a complex universe without knowing there was a person at the origin. He had found the person. He had sat across from Varric for several hours and had identified the shape of the thing that had been running behind both of their professional lives. That was the job. Find what is broken in the chain. Say it clearly. That was the entire job. He thought he could do that. He had been saying what happened in corridors for 17 years. It was the entire basis of his professional existence. The transfer happened with the formal precision of an action that had been documented before it occurred. Varric appeared at the door with two of his officers, and the posture of a person executing a procedure they had already filed the authorization for. And Marcus stood and followed, because the choreography was clear enough. The corridor outside the unmarked ship led to a docking junction. From the junction to a transit section he had not navigated before, and from there to a meeting point in the outer corridor, Olaf, the formal diplomat section, where Dreveth was waiting with 3 guards and the specific energy of a man who has spent several hours in controlled fury and has brought it down to something that looked like professional composure from the outside. Dreveth looked at Marcus with the quick assessment of someone updating a file in real time. Then, very briefly, with something that was not protocol, but was real. Something that did not have a professional name, but that Marcus recognized from faces he had seen in emergency situations on his convoy. When a colleague thought someone was not coming back, and they had come back, he said, in Galactic Standard. The Queen is in the council chamber. You will be brought directly. All right, Marcus said. Varric and Dreveth exchanged documentation without speaking. Brief, formal, witnessed, then they moved. The council chamber was one of the formal spaces Marcus had walked past but never entered on any of his working visits to Vithara. High ceiling, the specific grandeur of architecture, designed to carry the idea that decisions made here would matter. The gallery seating was partially occupied when Marcus arrived, more than he had expected. Observers, not only the council member representatives, but representatives of a dozen other interests, some in formal capacity, and some with the slightly disordered quality of people who had been summoned urgently and had not had time to prepare. Word had moved through the station the way significant things always moved in confined spaces. Athara was at the central table. She stood when she saw him. Not the stand of formal protocol. The stand of a person who has been waiting for someone to arrive and has now seen them arrive. The motion lasted less than 1 second before it was corrected, returned to the proper posture of a head of state in a formal session. But it had happened, and Marcus registered it in the fraction of a second before the correction came back, and something in him that had been holding against tension released a fraction. He crossed the chamber and sat in the position beside her that had been designated, and she looked at him with the specific quality of a glance between two people who have been in the middle of a conversation for some time and have not had the opportunity to finish it. "Are you injured?" she said, very quietly, in English. "Bruised rib," he said. They treated it. She processed this with the simultaneous expression of a person who is relieved and furious about the same piece of information at the same time. And then the session was called to order, and she was the queen of the Velkari Dominion in her posture and her face. The council chamber held 17-member representatives and the presiding elder in the position of process authority. The presiding elder was Velnarath of advanced age. Bleached of the pale coloring his kind started with into something almost white, which created the effect of a person reduced to essentials by long experience, as though what remained was purely what was necessary. His name was Sindarch Morotel. His appointment to the presiding position had been consolidated in the past 3 years. He had the eyes of someone who had been processing information for a very long time and had developed efficient habits around it, sharp, economical, with the quality of instruments that had been well used. He looked at the chamber with the quality of a man who has taken the measure of many rooms and found them consistently manageable. "This emergency session has been called," Morotel said, in Galactic Standard with the precision of decades of practice, "to address a matter of urgency regarding the unauthorized detention of a civilian registered to the Terran Diplomatic Service by military-designated personnel operating without confirmed civilian authorization." He paused. The detained civilian is present. He looked at Marcus with the mild finishing interest of someone adding the last detail to a picture already largely composed. "Mr. Vane, welcome to the council." "Thank you," Marcus said. Given the unauthorized nature of the detention, Morotel continued, "this session will also address questions regarding the Velkari Dominion's response, which appears to have involved the activation of intelligence-adjacent resources in a neutral zone, in possible contravention of Vithara Station's operational protocols." He looked at the chamber with the tone of a man presenting facts he is confident speak for themselves. "We are examining a pattern in which a head of state has made significant political decisions based on personal attachment to a private individual from an unclassified world. His gaze moved across the representatives with the ease of someone who has rehearsed this. The Queen has voted against Earth's reclassification 3 times. In each case, the margin traces to the Valkyrie block. The block's position traces to the Queen's personal judgment. The Queen's judgment traces to a logistics coordinator who helped her during an incident 7 years ago. He paused. One might ask whether Mr. Vane's presence here serves his homeworld's interests, or whether it primarily serves the interests those who have organized around him. He let that land. Then he added, with the pacing of a man saving a specific sentence, "We all grieve when our experiments fail." The Queen's grief, in this case, has been ongoing and politically expensive. The word experiment landed in the room and stayed there. Marcus felt Aethera go very still beside him. Marotel turned to Varric. "Executor Varric, given your presence in this matter, the Council would welcome your statement." Varric rose. He did not rise with the careful posture of a man delivering something prepared. He rose with the posture of a man who has made a decision and is executing it without any further internal deliberation. "The Council should be aware," Varric said, in a voice that was completely flat and completely final, "that the detention of Marcus Vane was authorized through a command chain that I have determined, in the past 12 hours, to be fraudulent in its origin." The chamber stopped being what it had been. The authorization I operated under was structured to appear as standard Velnarath Intelligence Directorate protocol, Varric said. "Correct format, correct authentication markers. I had no reason at the time to question its origin." He paused and looked at Marotel, not with accusation but with something colder than accusation. The look of a man placing evidence into a location where the person who most needs to confront it cannot look away from it. The authentication trail traces, through several institutional layers, to an administrative node within the presiding elder's private intelligence apparatus. The chamber noise changed quality entirely. Aethera's initial statement for the session record was brief and precise. The sequence of events, the unauthorized detention, the emergency transfer, the grounds on which the session had been called. She spoke without notes, in the fluent way of someone for whom formal session procedures were daily environment rather than studied protocol. The chamber attended to her with the varied quality of people who had not expected to be here and were recalibrating their understanding of what they were being asked to adjudicate. Then Varric spoke, and when he finished, the room was not the room it had been. Marotel's composure did not break, but something moved through it, something very small and very fast. The specific micro-adjustment of a man identifying which scenario he is in from among the scenarios he prepared for, he said, with the precise patience of a man who has been in rooms that shifted unexpectedly around him before. "Executor Varric, you are making a significant allegation on the basis of a trail that can be fabricated." "It can," Varric said. "It was not." He held Marotel's gaze. "And the trail does not end with the detention. The authorization chain for the original documentation exercise, 7 years ago, the exercise that placed Princess Aethera in a damaged service corridor specifically to document how a human vessel would respond, traces to the same administrative node." He paused. "You built the trap. You placed her in that corridor. You positioned the documentation unit. And when a human logistics coordinator did not behave according to your model, you sealed the footage and waited. You waited 7 years for the moment when you could use what grew out of your failure as a different kind of weapon." Something moved in Marotel's expression, something sharper than before. "These allegations require formal verification," he said. "An independent panel, 30 days minimum. This session has neither the time nor the mandate to treat unverified claims as established fact." His voice had taken on an edge, small, but there. "The Velnarath's authentication systems are not subject to the interpretation of a single executor operating outside his operational authority. The Orathani Independent Archive Service disagrees," Varric said. He sat. The chamber absorbed this. 17 representatives and a gallery of observers, each through the filter of what they stood to gain or lose from what they were hearing. Marotel turned his attention to Marcus. The turn was deliberate, a complete and precise reallocation of focus. "Mr. Vane, you were present on Vethara Station 7 years and 4 months ago during an incident involving a Valkyrie vessel." "I was," Marcus said. "Your presence in that incident has formed the basis of a significant relationship between yourself and Queen Aethera." "That is accurate. And Queen Aethera has, in the period since that incident, made several significant policy adjustments traceable to personal concern for your well-being and for the status of your homeworld. He said this in the tone of presenting uncontested facts. The most charitable interpretation is that her judgment has been influenced by sentiment. The least charitable is that a sovereign has been conducting galactic policy, as though it were a personal favor. He paused. I raise this not to disparage her motivations, which I am certain she finds entirely sincere, but to note that sincerity and good governance are not the same quality. He looked at Marcus with the mild interest of someone watching a variable perform as predicted. We all grieve, Mr. Vane. When our experiments fail, the Queen has been grieving for 7 years. It has cost her dominion considerably. The word again, experiment, twice now. Marcus looked at Ethara. She was looking at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface. She had not looked up. He thought about 7 years. He thought about 3 council votes. He thought about a queen reading shipping manifests every week for 5 years, telling herself it was political intelligence, knowing it was not only that. He thought about her telling him this morning, in a secure room over something that was not coffee, that she had been watching the direction from which the threat was coming. She had not told him. She had known for 7 years that he was at the center of something she was managing around him, and she had not told him, because telling him was the one action that would change how he moved through the world, would collapse the operational distance that made the protection work. She had carried 7 years of that calculation alone. He looked at her. She was still looking at the table, preparing herself for what she thought was coming next. Your Majesty, he said. Ethara looked up. Her eyes were the pale gold with the depth he had seen the first time. She was prepared for something, and whatever she was prepared for was visible in the way she was looking at him. You could not tell me, he said, quietly, in English, because telling me would have made me a target sooner. The pause before her answer was barely visible. Yes, she said, and you have been managing the consequences of that corridor for 7 years, he said, alone. Because if anyone knew the full reasoning behind your votes, the reasoning became a vulnerability. Yes, she said, he said, especially me. Because if I knew, I would change how I moved, and that would tell them that I knew, and that would tell them that you had told me, and that would confirm exactly the kind of relationship they wanted to expose. Yes, she said, and this time the single word had something in it that was not only acknowledgement, something that had been sitting inside the acknowledgement for 7 years and was now being set down in front of the person it had always been intended for. He nodded once. He turned back to Marotel, and what he saw on Marotel's face, for just one moment, was not the composed attention of a presiding elder managing a session. It was something that the elder had not quite gotten back under control in the second between Marcus speaking and Marotel composing himself again. Something recalculating, something that had been running a specific model of how this moment would go, and was now confronting the fact that the model had produced the wrong output. He had expected Marcus to be angry. He had built his entire strategy for this session around Marcus being angry. You authorized the original exercise, Marcus said to him. You placed her in that corridor. You built and maintained the Cold War between Velnarath and Velkari around the failure of that original operation, because the instability was more useful to you than any specific outcome of the conflict. And now you are using me as the lever to finish what you started 7 years ago, because you believe that as long as you can expose the Queen's attachment to me as politically compromising, you do not need the documentation you tried to create. You have a different kind of evidence. Marotel held his gaze with the composure of a man who does not lose composure and said, with a precision that had an edge in it, you are a logistics coordinator from an unclassified world. Mr. Vane, I would caution you against mistaking a summary of events for a grasp of their scope. Call the vote, Marcus said. Whatever vote you came here to call, and then let me address the council before it is cast. Marotel studied him. The study had the quality of a man who is listening to something in a mechanism that was not in the original design. Then, with the controlled deliberateness of a man who has calculated that the costs of refusing are higher than the costs of allowing, and who has not yet understood why that calculation might be wrong, he said. The request is noted. The address will occur before the final vote is cast. He looked at the chamber. The motion before this session regarding the reclassification of Earth's galactic designation will now be called. He almost smiled. It was very brief, and it was controlled. but Marcus saw it. The specific small expression of a man who has been maneuvered into a position and believes the person who maneuvered him there has just made a catastrophic mistake. Marcus looked at Ethara. She was watching him with the quality of a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and is not yet certain that what is arriving is what she has been waiting for. He looked at her hands on the table. They were still. The way hands were still when the person they belonged to was putting substantial effort into stillness. He thought about shipping manifests. He thought about a weekly intelligence summary with a standing item. He thought about someone deciding to read freight routes every week for 5 years and calling it political intelligence and knowing it was not only that. He thought about what it cost to carry something like that alone. Not the political management of it, which was its own significant weight, but the personal weight of knowing that a person whose routes you read every week did not know you were reading them and was going about their work in the specific ordinary way of someone who did not know they were at the center of anything. "Trust me," he said, quietly. She was quiet for one moment. Then, just as quietly, "I trusted you in a corridor 7 years ago. I have not stopped." He turned to face the chamber as the vote was called, and thought about what he was going to say, and found that he already knew. He had known since Varric's ship. He had known since the moment he understood that the thing Marotel could not control was the thing Marcus had no reason to conceal, because he had not known it was dangerous, because he had not known it existed as anything other than an ordinary moment in an ordinary day. The truth of what happened in a corridor, said clearly, because that was what you did when someone asked you to describe what you saw. The procedural frame was elegant, and Marcus could appreciate the elegance of it even while understanding precisely what it was designed to close. He had expected the documentary evidence to matter. Varric's authentication trail, the Orathani archive verification, the pattern of Marotel's administrative interventions traced over a decade. These were the things that should resolve a dispute of this type in galactic governance. Recorded evidence, independently verified. Speaking in the language the Council was built to process. What Marotel's allied representatives moved to do, in the procedural configuration of the pre-vote phase, was formally categorize all of it as unverified in origin, not disputed, unverified, a distinction that had specific meaning in Council procedural law. Unverified evidence could be entered into the record, but could not form the basis of a formal motion until the source had been independently authenticated by a recognized galactic process requiring a minimum of 30 days. The Orathani Archive Service was independent, but it was not a recognized galactic authentication authority for Council purposes. Authentication required a formal panel. Convening the panel required 30 days. The vote was in 30 minutes. Marcus watched the procedural moves happen with the focused attention he used when a logistics system was being navigated by someone who understood it better than he did and was using that understanding to make things arrive somewhere he did not want them to arrive. Not a direct challenge to any individual piece of evidence. A reclassification of the entire evidentiary category. It was clean. It had been prepared before this session began. He raised his hand when Marotel completed the procedural sequence. "I believe I was promised an address," he said. Marotel looked at him. Something still comfortable in his expression. Still in control. "You were," he said. "The address is testimony. Testimony is admissible under the standard witness provision." He gestured toward the center of the chamber. "The floor is yours, Mr. Vane." The chamber organized itself into listening configuration. Marcus stood. He looked at the room. 17 council representatives, Marotel at the presiding position, attentive and relaxed in the way of someone who believes they are watching someone walk into a mistake. Varric in the Velnarath observer position, with the quality of a man who has done what he came to do and is waiting for the room to finish catching up to it. Ethera beside where Marcus stood, with the composed posture of a head of state and, below it, something considerably more immediate. The gallery was full now. Word had moved through the station the way significant things always moved in confined spaces, and the observers had multiplied until the gallery held 3 times what it had when Marcus first entered the chamber. He had thought about what to say since Varric's ship, and had arrived at the same answer each time. Nothing prepared, nothing strategic, nothing that was trying to be the right thing, just what happened. The same way he had described the pod conditions to the medical team 7 years ago. because someone needed accurate information, and giving accurate information was what you did when someone needed it. I am going to start, he said, with something that is not about authorization chains or council votes or any of the things that have been discussed in this session. I am going to describe what I saw and heard and did on a specific day 7 years and 4 months ago, because that appears to be the event at the center of everything this room is discussing, and no one has yet described it directly. The chamber was quiet. I was on the Velkari Sovereign's hand to complete a manifest check for my convoy, he said. The main passenger deck was blocked for a security sweep, so I took the service corridor on deck 3. I misread the signage at the third junction because it was in a modified Velkari script I only half know, and I turned left instead of right. That put me in a section of the tertiary service corridor I had not been looking for. He paused. Let the chamber settle. The emergency lighting system was running in the secondary amber configuration, he said. Not full emergency red, secondary amber, which meant the damage control protocols had activated, but the ship had not yet classified the damage as requiring a full alert. There is a specific quality to secondary amber emergency lighting that does not match a serious crisis. Too warm, slightly wrong for the environment. The kind of light that makes you slow down because something tells you things do not match here. He stopped. There was a smell in the corridor, he said. I know now that it was the chemical reaction between Velkari hull sealant compound and a coolant leak in the tertiary duct. At the time I only knew it was wrong for a damaged corridor. Close to floral, almost sweet. Industrial, but accidentally sweet in a way that has no business in a ship that is taking damage. He paused. That smell was what made me look carefully at the junction ahead instead of passing through it quickly. And at that junction, I found an emergency pod that had been deployed internally in a secondary junction, non-standard configuration. The pod hatch was facing a support structure rather than an access panel, which was why the automated distress signal could not transmit past the hull, and why the ship's main alert system had not been triggered. He looked at the chamber. Inside the pod was a Velkari individual in medical distress, he said, respiratory compromise. The pod's internal monitoring display showed me the readings, and I relayed those readings over to my convoy's medical staff while I waited for the Sovereign's Hand's own team to arrive. When they arrived, I described the pod configuration to them, the lighting condition in the corridor, the smell, the approximate time since I found the individual, and the specific readings I had been monitoring. I described these things because someone needed accurate information, and giving accurate information was the obvious thing to do. Then I filed a logistics note and returned to my manifest check. He looked at the chamber steadily. I am asking, he said, whether anyone in this room has access to the sealed internal records of the Velkari Sovereign's Hand from that date, and if so, I am asking them to check 3 specific things against what I have just described. The emergency lighting configuration at the time of the incident, the hull sealant compound designation, and specifically its chemical reaction with the tertiary duct coolant in use that day, and the pod deployment record, specifically whether it shows a non-standard internal deployment in the secondary tertiary junction of deck 3. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment that had the particular weight of rooms absorbing something they need a moment with. Then, from the observer section, a figure Marcus had registered but not focused on rose from her seat. She was Vel Nerath, older than most of the representatives in the chamber, wearing the formal gray of an archival officer rather than diplomatic livery. She held a documentation tablet. I am the documentation archivist assigned to this session, she said, in Galactic Standard, with the accent of Vel Nerath high administrative speech. I hold access clearance to sealed operational records of Vel Nerath intelligence operations that intersect with this session's subject matter. The records for the Turthan Corridor incident, dated 7 years and 4 months prior, fall within my access category. She worked the tablet. 20 seconds, then 30. The chamber waited. The emergency lighting configuration at the time of the incident, she said, is documented in the operational field notes as secondary amber, not full alert status. The description provided by Mr. Vane is accurate. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Just a sound, not a word. The involuntary sound of a large group receiving confirmation of something. The archivist continued, her voice carrying to every part of the chamber without effort. The hull sealant compound used in the Sovereign's hand tertiary duct system is documented as Velkari Manufacturing Standard Type 11C. This compound reacts with the tertiary coolant in use at the time of the incident to produce a chemical signature described in the field notes as high aromatic and atypical for a damaged corridor environment. She paused. The pod deployment record shows a modified internal deployment in the secondary tertiary junction of Deck 3. Non-standard configuration, consistent with the description provided by Mr. Vane. She lowered the tablet. All three conditions described by Mr. Vane are accurate to the sealed operational record, she said. The record was sealed at the time of the incident and has not been accessed since, except by automated integrity verification protocols that flag modification attempts. It has not been modified. She looked at the chamber, with the direct quality of someone delivering a finding she is not interested in softening. The level of specific detail provided, the lighting configuration, the chemical reaction index, the non-standard pod deployment location, could not have been reliably fabricated from external documentation or general knowledge of the vessel type. The individual who described these conditions was present in that corridor on that date. She sat. The chamber erupted. Not disorder, something louder than order. All 17 representatives speaking simultaneously, to each other and to their advisors. The gallery producing the layered noise of a large group of different species, absorbing the same information at the same moment through the specific filters of what it meant for each of them. Translation devices running at capacity. The chamber was not quiet and was not going to be quiet for a moment. Marotel raised a hand for order. He did not get it immediately, which was the first time in the session that the room had not responded to him on the first signal. Then Varric stood. Varric stood and said, in a voice pitched to carry over the chamber noise without being raised, "Elder Marotel." The chamber went quieter. Something in the way he said the name. "I am formally requesting, before this council and on the record," Varric said, "that you relinquish the presiding chair pending the outcome of an independent investigation into the authorization chain I have presented today." The chamber went very quiet. Marotel looked at Varric. His composure was intact. His posture was correct. But the ease was gone from his expression. The relaxed attentiveness of a man watching someone walk into a mistake. What remained was still controlled, but it was working harder. "Your request is noted for the record," Marotel said. "It is not procedurally binding at this session." "No," Varric said. "It is not." He sat. "But it is on the record." The gallery noise had not resumed at its previous volume. The room had changed temperature. Then one of Marotel's three aligned representatives, the Velnarath in the secondary position, who had been very still during the archivist's testimony, stood. He stood and he looked at Marotel, and the looking had the quality of a decision that had been made and was now being executed. "I withdraw my affirmation of the motion," he said. The chamber held its breath. "I withdraw," he said, more clearly, "on the grounds that the evidentiary record of this session is materially inconsistent with the briefing I received from the presiding elder's office prior to this vote. Those inconsistencies require investigation before I can support any motion arising from this session." He looked at Marotel one more time. Then he sat. The chamber noise resumed, lower and more deliberate. "The sound of people doing urgent calculations," Marotel said, in a voice that was still controlled and would remain controlled because that was his nature. "The council will recess for 30 minutes before the vote proceeds." The 30 minutes were being used for something. Marcus understood that clearly. The kind of something that happens in the margins of formal proceedings when the proceedings have departed from their planned shape, and someone needs time to find the new shape. He was in the corridor outside the main chamber, standing at a viewport showing the station exterior, the dark and the ships, and the ordinary machinery of transit, when Marotel appeared beside him. Not with aids, not with documentation, the presiding elder alone, with the quality of a man who has determined that the most direct path to a specific outcome is a conversation without institutional witnesses. "Mr. Vane," he said, "you spoke effectively." "Thank you," Marcus said. "The archivist's confirmation is a complication," Marotel said. He stood beside Marcus at the viewport with the same remote, mild interest he appeared to bring to everything. Not an insurmountable one. What she confirmed is your presence in the corridor on that date. What she has not confirmed, and cannot confirm from a sealed operational record, is the authorization chain that produced the incident. That requires a panel. 30 days. In 30 days, there will have been a vote. There will have been a result. There will be implementation procedures already in motion. He paused. The vote today is what determines the next decade. Mr. Vane, the authorization question is a separate matter for proper process. You are suggesting I withdraw the testimony, Marcus said. I am suggesting that the situation can be resolved with considerably less disruption if certain emphases are adjusted going forward, Martel said. I am also in a position to be a useful ally for Earth's galactic standing over the coming decade. I have considerable institutional influence. Applied correctly, that influence can benefit humanity more significantly than a single vote can accomplish, more durably, more consistently. He looked at Marcus. I am offering you sustained protection with institutional weight. Marcus looked at him. He thought about the phrasing, sustained protection with institutional weight. He thought about what 7 years of protection with institutional weight looked like from the outside when it was working. The overnight resolutions, the canceled inspections, the contracts that disappeared and returned. Quiet, invisible, effective, like the institutional weight, he said, that arranged for an injured alien to be put in a damaged service corridor and positioned a documentation unit to record what a human would do next. Martel was quiet. You built a machine, Marcus said. It was designed to catch humans being indifferent to alien welfare, which was going to be your evidence that humanity was not ready for galactic standing. The machine ran and caught the wrong thing. So you adjusted. You waited. You watched what grew out of the failure and used it as a different kind of weapon. He held Martel's gaze. And now I am the piece that does not fit. And you are trying to pick me up and put me somewhere that makes the machine work again. Martel was quiet for a moment that had the quality of a calculation completing. And then something happened. Something that Marcus had not seen from him in the entire session. Martel stopped managing the conversation and said what he actually thought. Your species has been spacefaring for less than 200 years, he said. The pleasantness was gone from his voice. What remained was precise and cold and direct. In that time, you have accomplished nothing that any other species has not accomplished better, faster, and with considerably more stability. You expand chaotically. You conflict internally. You form emotional attachments to species you have met for the first time, and then you make political decisions based on those attachments as though they are equivalent to policy. He paused. The only remarkable thing humanity has produced in 2 centuries of galactic contact is a queen who reads your freight manifests. His voice had an edge in it now, very clean, and you are about to destroy what she built on the strength of that. Because you believe that saying what happened in a corridor is sufficient to stand against decades of galactic positioning. Because you believe that honesty is a strategy. Marcus looked at him. Honesty is not a strategy, Marcus said. Martel looked at him with the precise attention of a man who has heard something he is parsing. Honesty is just what you do when someone asks you what happened, Marcus said. I was in that corridor. I found someone who needed help. I helped her. I described what I saw accurately because it was what the situation required. I said the same things today because it was what this situation required. I am not trying to beat you. I am not trying to position anything. I am describing what happened in a corridor, and it happens to be true. And true things said in front of a galactic council with a documentation archivist present cannot be sealed away again. He paused. You built 7 years of strategy on the assumptions that I would calculate. I did not calculate in that corridor. I did not calculate today. You cannot beat something that is not playing. Martel held his gaze for a long moment. Something in his expression that was not quite the thing Marcus had been trained to look for when someone was defeated. Because Martel was not the kind of person who showed defeat, but something. A revision running at the speed of something that needs to be revised and does not have the time the revision requires. Your name is in the galactic record now, Martel said. The ordinary life you have been living is no longer available to you. I hope you understand what that costs. I understand it, Marcus said. He stood at the viewport for a moment after Martel left and looked at the dark. He thought about what the elder had said, not the offer. He was not going to think about the offer anymore. The other thing, the thing Martel had said when he stopped managing the conversation. Less than 200 years spacefaring. Nothing accomplished that another species had not done better, faster, with more stability. He thought about what that meant to someone who had been building galactic policy for decades, not as an insult, though it was that, as a working model, a species that had accomplished nothing notable in 2 centuries of contact, that expanded chaotically and conflicted internally, and formed emotional attachments where strategic calculation was expected. That was, in the model, a known and manageable quantity. The model was missing something that Martel had been demonstrating in his interactions with Marcus for the past 2 hours without recognizing that he was demonstrating it. He kept expecting Marcus to be calculating, to be positioning, to be angling for advantage. He kept recalibrating when Marcus was not doing any of those things, and he kept doing it without understanding what he was recalibrating for. Marcus was not calculating because there was nothing to calculate. He was in a corridor again. Someone needed something. He was doing the thing. He thought about the gap between Martel's model of what a human would do and what a human had done 7 years ago and again today, and about the fact that Martel kept encountering the gap without updating the model. Some models were load-bearing, he thought. The model was not wrong because of the evidence. The model was too important to Martel's institutional architecture to be wrong. So the evidence was the anomaly instead. He thought about all the decisions that flowed from that choice and turned and walked back into the chamber. He walked back into the chamber. The vote proceeded. Martel's 2 remaining aligned representatives voted to affirm. 7 representatives voted against. 3 abstained, including the Velnerath secondary representative, who had already withdrawn his affirmation, and who cast his abstention with the specific quality of a man completing a decision he arrived at on his own terms. The motion failed. The chamber moved, in the procedural cadence of formal galactic governance, to the matter of Varick's formal complaint against Martel's administrative apparatus. The complaint was seconded by Ethera. Formally and on the record, a panel was constituted. The investigation would take time, more than 30 days and more than 60, but it was constituted, and the authentication trail was on the record, and the archivist's confirmation was on the record. And things on the record did not disappear because they were inconvenient to the people who had preferred them absent. Martel presided over the remaining procedural matters with the same composed precision he had maintained throughout, because that was who he was, and that precision did not fail him even when the room had not gone where he arranged it to go. He would be formidable still. Marcus understood that clearly. The machine would be adjusted, and the influence was still real, and the process would be long. But the thing Marcus had said in that chamber was on the record and had been confirmed by a sealed archive, and it could not be unconfirmed. Varick filed the formal complaint against Martel's apparatus with the procedural precision of someone who has been preparing the filing for longer than the current session, and
is not going to let the energy of the room speed him into imprecision.
He read each section number and cited each authorization node, flat and specific. In the voice of a man doing a job he intends to have done correctly, regardless of how long it takes. 3 of the member representatives who had not been aligned with either Martel or Ethara's block before the session had changed their seating configuration, moving to positions that were not formally committed, but were geometrically closer to the Velkari side of the table than they had been 2 hours ago. It was the kind of shift that meant nothing on the record and meant something substantial in the conversations that would happen in the corridors after the session. The documentation archivist remained in her seat until the formal complaint was fully filed. Then she closed her tablet, stood, and walked toward the exit with the unhurried pace of a person who has done her work and is not interested in being thanked for it. As she passed Marcus's position, she paused and said, without looking at him directly, in Galactic Standard, "The record of today's session will be archived with the standard access controls. It will be available for historical reference in perpetuity, per council procedural mandate." Then she continued walking. Marcus thought about that for a moment. Then he understood what she had said. Not the words, the content. The session record was not just a document. It was a permanent galactic archive entry. Martel could adjust the investigation. He could manage the panel. He could apply institutional pressure to the process for as long as the process ran. But the archivist's confirmation was in the session record, and the session record was in the permanent archive. And what was in the permanent archive was there, not for 30 days, not for the duration of a formal proceeding, but for as long as anyone was maintaining the archive. The truth of what happened in a corridor, confirmed against a sealed operational record, was now in permanent galactic storage. He thought about what Marotel would do with that, and found that it changed the shape of the problem significantly. Not solved, but changed. When the session was formally closed, and the chamber began to dissolve into the organized motion of a convening ending, Athara did not immediately stand. She sat for a moment, with her hands on the table, looking at something that was not the table surface. Then she looked at him. They went out through a side corridor that Drivath held for them, into a quiet space with no observers. A maintenance access point with a viewport showing the station exterior. Not a diplomatic space. Not a space designed for anything but what it was, which meant it was the most private space immediately available. The station's operational hum was present here. The baseline sound of a structure doing its work, regular and without ceremony. She said, "The panel will take time." "I know," he said. Marotel's influence does not disappear because of a complaint and a confirmed authentication trail. Dismantling something built over decades takes time. "I know that too. And your name is in the galactic record," she said. She said it with the weight of someone who understands what that means for the person they are saying it to. "It will not come out." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have found a way to prepare you," she said. "Before you came, I should have given you more of the truth earlier." "I do not think it would have helped," he said. "If I had known, I would have been trying to say the right thing in there." "What I said because I was not trying to say the right thing. I was saying what happened." "Yes," she said. "I know." A pause. That was always the point of it. The station hum moved through the floor and the walls, the baseline sound of a system operating as designed. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. "When you came down that corridor," she said, "and you found the pod, did you think about walking past? Did any part of you calculate whether involvement exceeded what the situation required of you?" He thought about it honestly, actually thought about it. The way you think about something you have not examined in a long time. "No," he said. "Why not?" she said. He paused. "Because there was someone in there who needed help," he said. "And I was there. So I helped." He looked at the viewport, the dark beyond it, the ships. "I did not think there was another option." Not stopping felt like the strange choice. She held his gaze, and the pale gold of her eyes in the dim light of a maintenance corridor had the patient quality of something that has been waiting for a very long time, and has just arrived at the moment it was waiting for. "I did not know," she said quietly, "whether you would stop." He looked at her. "I heard you coming," she said, "and I thought, he might walk past. He does not know me. He has no reason to stop. He might walk past, and I would have no way to stop him and no logical reason to expect otherwise." That was the most frightening part. Not the pod, not the damage, not being alone in there. The fact that I did not know. Her voice was steady, but the words had the quality of something that had been held for a very long time and was being set down carefully, in front of the right person, in the right moment. "I heard your footsteps and I did not know." Marcus was quiet. "And then I heard you humming," she said, "and something changed. I activated the interior light." She paused. "I have told this story in many contexts over 7 years. In every version. I say you found me. You assisted. You stayed. I never say that I made a decision to trust a sound in a corridor before I had any other information. Because in the telling, it sounds like the decision of someone who was not thinking clearly under extreme pressure." She held his gaze. "But I was thinking clearly. I heard something in the quality of how you were moving through that space, and I decided, on that basis alone, that you were someone who would stop. And I have been making political decisions on the strength of that one decision ever since." Marcus thought about what that meant. The specific sound of a habit he had never been able to account for. The interior distress light activating because of it. 7 years of political decisions made from that single moment of deciding to trust a sound. "Okay," he said, which was, again, entirely inadequate. But it was the honest thing. It was always the honest thing. She looked at him for a long moment, and something happened to her expression that was not composed, not diplomatic, not the quality of a head of state managing a situation. Something that had been held under those things for a long time and had just been released, in a maintenance corridor, with no observers, in front of the person who had earned the right to see it. Not the queen, not the diplomat, the person who had been in a pod for 40 minutes listening to footsteps. For what it is worth, she said, I have never once, in 7 years, believed that what you did was exceptional. I think it was ordinary. I think it was the ordinary behavior of a particular kind of person in a particular kind of moment. I think you are that kind of person, and that the galactic community has fundamentally and consistently underestimated how many people like you exist. She paused. I think that is the thing Marotel could not build a model for. Not the heroism, the ordinariness. He sat with that for a moment. How long before the briefings start? He said. She considered this with the seriousness she appeared to bring to all questions, regardless of scale. I have delayed the first one by 30 minutes, she said. The Terran consulate will want documentation. The Council Record Office will want a statement. Diplomatic staff from several member species have already filed requests. 30 minutes, he said. Yes, there is a commissary on the commercial level that has real coffee, he said. I checked the station damage report when I had comm access earlier, and the blast was confined to the East infrastructure segment. The commissary is in the West commercial section, still standing. He paused. If you wanted to be somewhere that is not a formal room for 30 minutes. She looked at him, a queen, standing in a maintenance corridor, being invited to drink coffee. The look had several things in it simultaneously, and he could see all of them, and he did not look away from any of them. The Velkari equivalent of coffee, she said, involves a distillation process that takes 40 minutes and 3 separate temperature stages. So not coffee, he said. Emphatically not coffee, she said. I have tried it, on 3 occasions, in the interest of diplomatic completeness, and he said. It is extremely bitter, she said. I understand why your species drinks it regardless. He did not say anything for a moment. Then it would be a reasonable thing to sit with for 30 minutes, he said, before everything starts. Yes, she said. It would. They walked out of the maintenance corridor and back into Vithara station, where the commercial level was resuming the organized noise of a working port, with the specific resilience of commercial spaces that have absorbed disruptions before and have good reasons to continue operating. They found a table near a window with a view of the exterior, the dark and the ships in it, and sat down. The coffee was real. The coffee commissary had 3 tables near the exterior viewport, and they had taken the one nearest to it. The cargo traffic outsides was resuming with the specific purposefulness of commercial systems that do not stay stopped longer than they have to. She held her cup in both hands in the way of someone not accustomed to the shape of the vessel, but not interested in acknowledging this. At one point, she asked him how he had ended up in humanitarian logistics. He told her the short version, a cargo contract that fell through in his 3rd year, a humanitarian organization that needed someone who already knew the freight infrastructure in a specific sector. A first assignment that turned into a second and a third and a career. The work had the specific quality of work, where knowing what you were doing made a visible difference to specific people, rather than contributing to outcomes you would never directly observe. She listened with the quality of someone who asks questions they want the answers to. You have been doing this for 17 years, she said, and in all that time, you never knew your convoy routes were being read for any purpose other than cargo verification. I knew freight manifests were accessible to port authorities, he said. I did not know anyone was reading them for another purpose. And knowing now, she said, does it change how the work feels? He thought about it. No, he said. The work is the same work. The cargo needed to go where it went. The manifests needed to be filed. The context changed. The work did not. She looked at him across the table. Outside the viewport, a cargo transport completed its pre-departure sequence and began moving away from the station, getting smaller, doing what it was built to do. I think, she said, that is the most accurate description of what you did in that corridor that I have ever heard anyone give. The context changed. The work did not. He held his cup and said nothing. There was nothing to add to it that would improve it. The 30 minutes were as quiet as 30 minutes get when you have just changed the direction of something that was already in motion, and the next thing has not quite started, and someone is sitting across from you who made a decision about you based on the sound of your humming in a corridor, and turned out to be right. Outside the viewport, the ships moved on their vectors, patient and purposeful, doing what they were built to do. Marcus held his coffee cup and looked at the dark and thought about a wrong turn and a misread sign and a habit he had never been able to account for, and about how far any of those things could travel through a system when the right person was waiting at the other end. The 30 minutes passed. They went to face what came next. Marcus walked out of the commissary and into the corridor that led back to the diplomatic wing, and the machinery of what came next started immediately. The Terran consular aide was the first person he saw, with the expression of someone who has been waiting and is relieved to have something to be organized about. The aide had 3 people behind him with documentation tablets and the kind of focused professional energy that institutions deployed when something unexpected had occurred. And the protocol for unexpected
Things was to document everything immediately.
The first briefing took 40 minutes and produced 17 separate documentation filings. The second briefing, with the Council Record Office, took an hour between sessions. Marcus sat in the anteroom designated for him and drank the remaining station coffee from a portable commissary unit that the consular aide had arranged, which was considerate and which he appreciated. Ethera's briefings ran simultaneously in a different section of the diplomatic wing, with the Velkari delegation, and then with the Allied representatives who had already requested a preliminary discussion about the panel composition. He heard, through the consular aide who was tracking the proceedings, that the Orathani representative had submitted an observation watch request for the panel, and that the ally who had withdrawn his vote had filed a formal statement of independent assessment. The documentation was moving. The machinery was doing its work. He did not see her again that day. The schedule did not allow for it, and the schedule was the schedule. He thought about the footage in the sealed documentation that she had described. A man in a corridor saying that help was coming for 11 minutes to someone who might not have been able to hear him. He thought about whether he would have known to say it if he had not been sure she could hear. He thought, probably yes. Not because it was strategic, because it was the kind of thing you said in a corridor when someone was in a pod and you were outside it, and help was coming, because it was the obvious right thing to say. He did not think that made it remarkable. He thought it made it ordinary. He thought ordinary things being said clearly in the right moment might be, in the end, the most reliable mechanism anyone had. He filed a message to his convoy's logistics coordinator explaining the adjusted schedule and noting that the Doroth Run documentation should be held pending his return and that she should not reorganize the freight manifest, which she would. But he wanted it on record that he had told her not to. Then he went back to his briefing.